Hey everyone, and welcome back to You Talk. We listen. We'll get right to it today. But first, a huge thank you to our sponsor, OtisWho Network. You know them. You love them. They're the best. Okay, so today we're diving into a case that I know a lot of you are interested in. The trial of Daniel Penny. We got a ton of messages and articles about it.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one. So many important issues all colliding at once. Mental health, public safety, race, the whole idea of self-defense. We're going to try to unpack it all for you.
Definitely a lot to unpack. So to kind of set the stage, this all went down back in May 2023 on a New York City subway car. Daniel Penny, a former Marine, was on the train when he encountered Jordan Neely. Neely was a homeless man who witnesses say was acting erratically and making threats.
Right, and it's important to note that Jordan Neely wasn't just some random guy. He was actually pretty well known in New York. A Michael Jackson impersonator who had been struggling with mental illness and homelessness for years. His story, even before this tragic incident, really highlights the challenges so many people face when they're dealing with mental health issues and living on the streets.
Absolutely, and sadly, those challenges came to a head on that subway car. During the encounter, Penny ended up restraining Neely using what's been described as a chokehold. And tragically, Neely died during the struggle.
And that's where the legal battle really kicks off.
Yeah.
The prosecution's main argument was that Penny went too far, that he used excessive force with that chokehold and that it directly caused Neely's death. They were basically saying that Penny, with his military background, overreacted to the situation and used deadly force when it wasn't justified.
But the defense had a very different take on things, obviously. Their argument was that Penny was just trying to protect himself and the other passengers from what he saw as a real and immediate threat.
And that's where this whole concept of reasonable force comes in. The defense had to convince the jury that even though the outcome was horrible, Penny's actions were still a reasonable response to the threat he believed Neely posed at that time. They actually argued that Penny's military training helped him assess the situation and respond in a measured way.
Right, and of course there's that video footage too, the one taken by another passenger on the train. That video went viral almost immediately, and it really fueled a lot of the public outcry surrounding this case. But as we've talked about before, video evidence doesn't always tell the whole story.
Oh, absolutely. It's just a snapshot in time. In this case, the video only shows a part of what happened, and there's been so much debate about what it really shows and how to interpret it. The jury had to look at that video alongside all the other evidence. Eyewitness testimony, medical reports, the whole picture.
Okay, so let's get into the legal charges themselves. Initially, Penny was charged with second-degree manslaughter, a serious felony. But then in a pretty big twist, the judge actually dismissed that charge after the jury couldn't agree on a verdict.
Yeah, that was a huge development. The fact that the manslaughter charge was dropped suggests that the prosecution had a hard time proving Penny acted with the level of intent required for that charge.
So what exactly does it take to get a manslaughter conviction?
Well, the prosecution had to prove that Penny acted with a certain state of mind that's legally called recklessness. Basically, it means he consciously ignored a very real and unjustifiable risk that his actions could lead to someone's death.
So it's not about intending to kill someone,
Right.
but it's more than just carelessness or an accident.
Right. It's about knowingly taking a risk that any reasonable person would understand could result in death. The fact that the jury was deadlocked suggests that some of them weren't convinced that Penny's actions met that really high bar of recklessness.
So with the manslaughter charge gone, the jury had to consider a lesser charge, criminally negligent homicide. What's the key difference between those two charges?
The big difference is the mental state they have to prove.
Okay, so break that down for us.
Well, manslaughter requires recklessness, right, like we talked about. But criminally negligent homicide only requires criminal negligence.
And what does that mean exactly, criminal negligence?
It basically means you fail to see a substantial and unjustifiable risk that what you're doing could cause someone's death. It's still a serious charge, but it doesn't involve that same level of knowingly disregarding human life that recklessness does.
So in Penny's case, the jury had to decide if his actions, even though he didn't intend to kill Neely, were still so far outside the bounds of reasonable behavior that they qualified as criminal negligence.
Exactly. They had to figure out if a reasonable person in Penny's situation would have understood that what he was doing could result in Neely dying. And that gets really complicated because you have to think about what a reasonable person would even do in a chaotic, high-pressure situation like that, and whether things like fear and adrenaline can factor into culpability.
This whole case has become such a flashpoint, hasn't it? You have people calling Penny a hero for stepping in to protect others, and people calling him a vigilante for taking the law into his own hands. It seems like everyone has a strong opinion one way or another.
Yeah, it's because this case touches on so much more than just the legal arguments. It gets into people's deep-seated beliefs about race, social justice, individual responsibility versus societal support. It's really forcing us to confront some uncomfortable truths about how we deal with mental health, homelessness, and public safety, especially in big cities like New York.
Okay, so we've laid out the basic facts of the case and the legal charges. But let's really dig into the arguments that were made by both sides. What were the key points the prosecution was making to try and get a conviction?
Their strategy was basically two-pronged. First, they really hammered on the length of time Penny held Neely in that chokehold. They argued that even if you could say the initial restraint was justified, he held on for way too long, even after Neely stopped struggling and the threat seemed to be gone.
So they were trying to show that Penny went beyond what was necessary to stop the threat, that he kept using force when he didn't need to anymore.
Exactly. And then their second big point was about the power dynamic between them. They painted this picture of Penny as a strong, capable former Marine using excessive force against Neely, who was obviously in a mental health crisis and much more vulnerable. They argued that Penny, with all his training, should have been able to de-escalate the situation without using that kind of potentially lethal force.
That's definitely a powerful argument, and it taps into a lot of people's concerns about abuse of power, especially when you have someone with military training involved. But of course, the defense presented a totally different story. What were their main points in trying to counter those arguments?
Well, they really wanted to establish the context of Neely's behavior leading up to that moment. They brought in witnesses who said that Neely was acting really erratically, shouting threats and making people genuinely afraid. Their argument was that Penny was faced with this threat and he just reacted instinctively to protect himself and the other passengers on that train.
So they were portraying him as someone who was just trying to do the right thing in a really chaotic and possibly dangerous situation.
Right. They said his actions, even though they had this tragic outcome, were motivated by a desire to protect people from harm. And they also challenged the idea that the chokehold was the only reason Neely died.
How did they do that? Didn't the medical examiner rule his death a homicide caused by compression of the neck?
Yeah, they did. But the defense brought in their own medical experts who said the evidence wasn't that straightforward. They pointed to the toxicology report, which showed Neely had drugs in his system, and they suggested that an adverse reaction to those drugs, or maybe an overdose combined with the stress of the struggle, could have also contributed to his death.
So basically they were saying the chokehold might have been a factor, but it wasn't necessarily the only or even the main cause of death.
Exactly. They argued that the medical evidence was complicated and the jury shouldn't just assume the chokehold alone was responsible.
So you have these dueling experts, each side using medical evidence to support their version of events. Sounds like the jury had a really tough job trying to sort through all of that. No wonder they couldn't agree on that manslaughter charge.
And remember, in a criminal trial, the standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. It wasn't about figuring out with absolute certainty the exact cause of death. It was about whether the prosecution proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Penny's actions were a direct cause.
Which brings us back to that moment when the judge dismissed the manslaughter charge. It seems like the jury was really struggling with that question of intent.
Yeah, the two notes they sent to the judge saying they were deadlocked. It suggests that at least some of them couldn't reconcile Penny's actions with that legal definition of recklessness. They might have felt that even though his actions had awful consequences, they didn't meet the level of criminal intent needed for that specific charge.
So then with manslaughter out of the picture, the jury had to decide if Penny's actions fit the definition of criminally negligent homicide. What are the main elements of that charge, and what would they have focused on in their deliberations?
For criminally negligent homicide, they don't have to prove that Penny meant to hurt Neely, just that he acted with criminal negligence. It's easier to prove than manslaughter, but they still had to show that his actions were a major deviation from what a reasonable person would do.
So the question becomes, were Penny's actions so careless, so reckless, that they were a big departure from what a reasonable person would have done, and did that ultimately lead to Neely's death?
Exactly. The prosecution was likely focusing on how long that chokehold went on, arguing that even if Penny didn't mean to kill Neely, holding him like that for so long showed a level of negligence that met the standard for this charge. They probably also emphasized that Penny had other options, that he could have restrained Neely without using a chokehold, and that his decision to use that particular method was unreasonably reckless.
And what about the defense? How do you think they responded to that?
I imagine they stuck with their portrayal of Penny as someone acting in good faith, trying to protect himself and others in this super stressful and unpredictable situation. They probably argued that the adrenaline and fear of that moment affected his decisions, and that he really believed the chokehold was necessary to control what he saw as a serious threat.
It sounds like it really boils down to these two competing narratives. Was Penny a reckless vigilante who went too far, or was he a well-intentioned guy who made a terrible mistake in a high-pressure situation?
And the jury had to wade through all of that and decide if the prosecution had proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Penny's actions met the definition of criminal negligence. It's not an easy decision, and it makes sense why this case has caused so much debate and strong feelings.
We've just scratched the surface of this complex case, and in the next part of our deep dive, we're going to explore some of the bigger social and ethical questions it raises. Questions about how we as a society deal with mental health crises, homelessness, and the use of force in public spaces.
I mean, this case has really become like a focal point for all these really tough issues we're dealing with as a society. Mental health, homelessness, public safety, all these things we tend to avoid talking about are suddenly front and center.
Yeah, it's like it's exposed this raw nerve, like we're being forced to confront just how unprepared we are to deal with the complexities of mental illness, especially when it intersects with homelessness and public safety.
And what's so interesting is that both sides in this case actually used Jordan Neely's mental health, but in totally different ways. The prosecution used it to emphasize how vulnerable he was, to argue that he was less likely to be a real threat and more in need of support and compassion.
And the defense sometimes seemed to use it almost like an excuse for his behavior. Like because he was mentally ill, his actions were automatically unpredictable and dangerous, and that justified Penny's response.
Right. And that's where the stigma surrounding mental illness gets so dangerous. On the one hand, we're saying we need more understanding and empathy, recognizing that people with mental illness are way more likely to be victims of crime than perpetrators. But then there's this other side of it, this fear-based narrative that paints them as inherently unstable and potentially violent.
It's like this double standard, isn't it? We say we want to help people with mental health challenges, but then when those challenges become visible in public, we often react with fear and suspicion.
This case has really shown just how inadequate our approach to mental health is. Instead of investing in strong community-based services, supportive housing crisis intervention teams that can help people before things escalate, we end up relying on law enforcement to handle situations that they're not really equipped for.
It's this reactive cycle. We underfund mental health services. More people end up on the streets struggling to get the help they need. And then when those struggles become visible in public spaces, we criminalize them instead of offering support.
And we've seen this happen over and over again. This case is a stark reminder of what happens when we fail to act. It's not just about this one tragic incident. It's about the systemic failures that led to this point and the urgent need to change how we as a society approach mental health.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about mental health, but this case also brings up some big questions about the use of force, especially when someone claims they were acting in self-defense or to protect others. Where do we draw the line between protecting ourselves and going too far, using excessive force that could be deadly?
Yeah, that's the big question, and it's one that's been debated for centuries by legal experts and ethicists. The law does recognize the right to use force in self-defense, but there are limits. It's not a free pass. The force you use has to be in proportion to the threat you're facing, and it has to stop once the threat is gone.
So in this case, it comes down to whether Penny's actions crossed those legal boundaries. Did he use more force than was really necessary to stop Neely?
Right, and that's where the jury had to look at all the evidence and decide if what Penny did was reasonable under those specific circumstances. The prosecution argued that the chokehold itself was inherently dangerous, and that Penny kept holding Neely even after it was clear the threat was over. They emphasized that with Penny's military background, he should have had other options besides using a chokehold, which can be lethal.
And the defense countered by saying that Penny was just reacting on instinct in a very high-pressure situation, and that he genuinely thought the chokehold was necessary to protect himself and others. They also argued that his military training actually helped him assess the threat and respond appropriately.
And that gets to the heart of this legal idea of reasonable belief. To justify using force in self-defense, it's not enough to show there was an actual threat. You also have to show that the person who used force had a reasonable belief that they were in danger.
So the jury basically had to put themselves in Penny's shoes and decide if his belief that he was in danger was reasonable, even if it turned out later that maybe the danger wasn't as serious as he thought.
Exactly. It's a subjective standard, but there are still limits. The belief has to be something that a reasonable person in that same situation would also hold. It can't be based on prejudice or fear-mongering or a distorted view of reality.
And of course, we can't talk about the use of force without talking about the issue of racial injustice and police brutality. That's something that looms over this entire case.
Absolutely. The shadow of George Floyd's murder and all the other cases of unarmed black men dying at the hands of police. It's definitely present in this trial, even though Penny himself wasn't a police officer.
It's like this case is forcing us to confront, on a smaller scale, the same questions we're wrestling with as a country. When is it okay to use force? Who gets the benefit of the doubt when they claim self-defense? And how do we make sure the justice system treats everyone fairly, regardless of race or social status or mental health?
These are huge questions, and there aren't any easy answers. This case has exposed these deep divisions in our society, and it's going to take a lot of introspection and difficult conversations to even begin to address them.
This case also highlights how powerful race and implicit bias can be, and how the public sees this case, and maybe even how it affects the outcome of the trial. You can't ignore the racial dynamics here. A white former Marine restraining a black homeless man who was struggling with mental illness.
You're right. This case has triggered such strong reactions on both sides. Some people see Penny as a hero who stepped up to protect people. Others see his actions as a form of vigilantism that's rooted in racial bias. The fact that Neely was a black man experiencing homelessness and mental health challenges, and Penny is a white former Marine. It definitely influences how people interpret what happened and who they blame.
And those implicit biases can affect every part of the legal process. From the initial police investigation to whether the prosecution decides to press charges to the jury's final verdict. It's a reminder that even in a system that's supposed to be blind to race and other social factors, those factors can still have a huge impact on how justice is served, often without people even realizing it.
It really shows how much work we still need to do to dismantle systemic racism and to make sure that everyone, no matter their race or background, has an equal chance at a fair trial. This case is a microcosm of the bigger fight for racial justice and equality that's happening all over the country.
So we have all these intertwined issues: mental health, public safety, the use of force, race, implicit bias, all converging in this one case. It's no wonder it's gotten so much attention and sparked such heated debate. We talked a lot about the legal side of things and the arguments from both sides. But I think there's another piece of this that we need to consider: how the media has covered this case and how that might have affected things.
Yeah, it's impossible to ignore the media circus around this trial. I mean, right from the start when that video went viral, it's been nonstop coverage. Headlines, opinion pieces, social media commentary. That kind of scrutiny has to have some kind of impact.
And it hasn't exactly been unbiased coverage either, have it? It seems like every media outlet has their own agenda. Some paint Penny as a vigilante, others as a hero. And it feels like in all of that, Jordan Neely's story gets lost sometimes. His struggles with mental illness, his experiences as a homeless man.
That's the problem with the 24/7 news cycle. It's all about getting clicks and views and pushing narratives that people already agree with. Nuance and complexity just don't get the same attention as these simple good versus evil stories.
There's been a lot of talk about whether all this media attention could actually make it harder for the jury to be impartial.
Oh, absolutely. The judge even told the jury to avoid media coverage and just focus on the evidence presented in court. But let's be real. In today's world, it's almost impossible to completely tune out all the noise. Even if jurors try to avoid news and social media, they're still going to see headlines and snippets of information everywhere.
Like trying to avoid the tide coming in.
Right, you can try to hold it back, but it's going to find a way in.
And that makes you wonder how fair these high-profile trials can really be. Can someone get a fair trial when potential jurors are bombarded with information that's often sensationalized or emotionally charged?
This is a tough question.
We have freedom of the press, which is important. And the public has a right to know what's happening in our courts. But we also have to make sure defendants get a fair trial. And that means having a jury that's not swayed by outside influences.
It's a tricky balance, but I think the most important thing is that we as media consumers are aware of this. We have to be critical of what we read and hear, seek out different perspectives, and remember that the media isn't supposed to decide guilt or innocence. Their job is to report the facts and let the legal process do its thing.
It's on us as citizens to have these important conversations, to not jump to conclusions based on headlines, and to push for a justice system that's fair and impartial and accountable.
This case, it's definitely been challenging and emotional, but it gives us this opportunity to really look at ourselves and our society, to examine our own biases, and to work towards a more just and equitable world.
We've covered so much ground today. We started with the specifics of the Daniel Penny trial, but we ended up talking about all these bigger issues: mental health, public safety, race, the media. These are all connected in a way.
It's what makes this case so fascinating and so troubling. It's a reflection of so many of the challenges we face. And it reminds us that these are complicated issues that deserve our attention and our engagement.
As we wrap up, the jury is still out. We're all waiting to hear their decision. But no matter what that verdict is, the conversations this case started will continue, and they should continue.
Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about Daniel Penny and Jordan Neely. It's about who we are as a society, what kind of world we want to create, how we treat the most vulnerable among us, how we respond to crises, and how we make sure justice is truly blind.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, keep asking questions, and we'll see you next time.